Dale Rutherford's hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the walnut stock of his Winchester. The December wind, a blade honed on the peaks of the Cabinet Mountains, sliced through the Montana wilderness. But that wasn't why he was trembling. 20 feet ahead, hanging from the thick, snow-dusted branch of a Douglas fir like some grotesque, obscene flag, was something his mind refused to accept as real. The morning sun, low and weak, filtered through the canopy, illuminating what appeared to be a complete human skin, flayed with surgical precision from head to toe, swaying gently in the breeze. The face was still recognizable, frozen in an expression of absolute, uncomprehending terror that would sear itself into Dale's nightmares for the rest of his life. It was Jimmy Kowalski, the poacher who'd been working these same woods illegally for the past 3 seasons. But the skin wasn't what made Dale's bladder threaten to release, sending a hot, shameful pressure through his abdomen. It was what lay beneath the hanging trophy, arranged with deliberate, chilling precision in the blood-soaked snow. The skinless body sat upright against the tree trunk, positioned as if waiting, as if watching. The exposed musculature glistened wetly in the frigid air, and Dale could see every striation of tissue, every tendon and ligament laid bare in a horrifying anatomical display. The eyes were gone from the body, just empty, dark sockets staring at nothing, but the skin above still had them. Those dead eyes in the dangling face seeming to look directly at Dale, with an accusation he would never escape. The snow around the base of the tree was stained in a wide circle of deep crimson, already freezing into pink crystalline ice. Dale's rational mind, the part of him that had spent 63 years understanding the natural world, tried to explain this away. A bear, maybe, or a mountain lion driven mad by hunger, or even a person, some sick, twisted killer. But deep in his gut, in that primal place where instinct lives, he knew better. He'd seen the tracks leading to this place. He'd smelled that ungodly stench that had been growing stronger for the past 3 days. He'd heard those sounds in the night that were not quite howls and not quite screams. And now, standing here in this desecrated clearing, Dale understood with horrible, soul-crushing clarity that he'd crossed an invisible boundary, that he was standing exactly where he should not be, and that whatever had done this to Jimmy Kowalski was somewhere in these woods watching him right now, deciding whether he would be the next warning marker or whether he would be allowed to leave and spread the message that these mountains belonged to something else, something old and savage and utterly, utterly merciless. The nightmare had begun 7 days earlier, on a Monday morning that had seemed ordinary in every way. Dale Rutherford woke at 4:30 in the morning, the same as he had every day for the past 42 years. At his age, his body operated on a clock more reliable than any alarm. The cabin was cold, the cast-iron wood stove having burned down to a bed of glowing embers during the long night, and his breath misted in the profound darkness as he swung his legs out of bed. His joints protested with their usual morning complaints, the arthritis in his knees and shoulders announcing itself with dull, persistent aches that would fade once he got moving. He dressed in the dark, a ritual of layers, long underwear, thick wool socks, canvas work pants worn soft with use, and a heavy flannel shirt that had seen better days. The fabric was thin at the elbows, patches covering patches in some places, but it was warm, and that was all that mattered this deep into a Montana December. The cabin sat 15 miles outside of Whitefish, accessible only by a rough logging road that became impassable once the heavy snows came, usually by mid-January. Dale had built the place himself 30 years ago, back when his wife Sarah was still alive, back when the isolation felt romantic and chosen, rather than merely lonely. It was a simple structure, one large room with a sleeping loft, a kitchen area that consisted of a propane stove and a hand-pump sink fed by a mountain spring, and the wood stove that served as the sole source of heat. No electricity, no phone, no internet, just the way Dale preferred it. The modern world could keep its noise and its chaos. Out here, a man could think, could breathe, could live according to rhythms that went back thousands of years. He struck a match, the sulphurous flare momentarily blinding him, and lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table. The warm yellow glow pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing the familiar Spartan interior of his home. While the coffee water heated on the propane stove, its hiss the only sound in the stillness, Dale pulled on his boots, thick leather affairs with steel toes, lacing them with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed the same task tens of thousands of times. Through the single condensation-fogged window that faced east, he could see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the sky, though sunrise was still more than an hour away. The forecast had called for clear weather, temperatures in the low 20s, perfect conditions for checking his trapline. Dale had been running traplines in these mountains since he was 16, learning the trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. The Rutherford family had been trapping in Montana for 4 generations, though Dale knew he would be the last. He had no children, and even if he had, the market for furs wasn't what it used to be. Still, he could make enough to get by, supplementing his income with the modest pension from his 20 years working for the Forest Service. More than the money, the work kept him active, kept him connected to the land, and gave his days a purpose and structure that held the loneliness at bay. His current trapline ran in a rough circle through the wilderness, covering approximately 25 miles of rugged terrain. He'd set 40 traps total, strategically placed along game trails, near water sources, in areas where the sign, scat, tracks, disturbed undergrowth, indicated regular animal traffic. Mostly he caught marten and fisher, occasionally a fox or a bobcat. The traps were checked every 3 days religiously, both to ensure trapped animals didn't suffer longer than necessary and to comply with state regulations. It was hard, unforgiving work, especially in winter, but Dale took a quiet pride in doing it right, in treating the animals with respect, in taking only what the land could sustainably provide. The coffee finished percolating, and Dale poured himself a cup of the thick black liquid, grimacing at the bitter taste. He'd never developed a fondness for the stuff, but it was fuel, and fuel was necessary for the work ahead. While he drank, he studied his topographic map, spread across the table and held flat by coffee cans at each corner. The map was a palimpsest of his life, covered in pencil marks, X's indicating trap locations, dotted lines showing the route he took to check them. Today he'd be covering the northern section of the line, the most difficult terrain, where the land rose sharply toward the Cabinet Mountains wilderness. By 5:30, with the sky just beginning to show real light, Dale was ready. He shouldered his pack, heavy with supplies, extra traps, bait, wire, tools, a first aid kit, an emergency blanket, waterproof matches, rope, a skinning knife. His rifle, a well-maintained Winchester Model 70 and 30-06, hung from a sling across his chest. The rifle wasn't for trapping, but a man didn't go into the Montana wilderness unarmed, not if he had any sense. Bears, mountain lions, wolves, all were present in these mountains, and while attacks on humans were rare, they weren't unheard of. Better to have the gun and not need it than the reverse. The morning air hit him like a physical slap when he stepped outside, cold and clean and sharp with the scent of pine. The sky above was clear, stars still visible in the west, fading as the eastern horizon brightened from black to deep blue to pale gold. Snow crunched under his boots, the frozen crust supporting his weight. 6 inches had fallen 3 days ago, and the temperature hadn't risen above freezing since, leaving everything locked in winter's grip. Dale's breath streamed behind him as he walked, his lungs burning pleasantly with the cold air. The first 12 traps were a mixed bag. Several were empty, 2 held marten with their rich, dark fur, and 1 held a fisher. At the 13th trap located near a small stream that still ran despite the cold, Dale first noticed something was profoundly wrong. The trap, a heavy conibear designed for large predators, had been sprung but was empty. The snow around it was churned up, trampled by something large. Dale knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, to examine the tracks, his practiced eye reading the story written in the snow. Something had approached the trap, triggered it, and then torn it apart. The heavy steel jaws were bent, actually bent, twisted out of alignment with a force that should have been impossible. Dale picked up the ruined trap, turning it over in his hands. The steel was thick, designed to hold a bear if necessary, but something had wadded it up like tinfoil. The tracks were partially obscured by the disturbance, but Dale could make out enough to see they were wrong. They looked almost human, like massive barefoot prints, but elongated. The toes spread unnaturally wide, the heel driven deep into the snow. Each print was at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. No human had feet that big, and no human would be walking barefoot in the Montana wilderness in December. Dale felt the first whisper of unease, a cold trickle down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd seen bear tracks his whole life, and these weren't bear tracks. Bears had claws that showed clearly, and their hind feet had a distinctive kidney bean shape. These prints were different, wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He stood, scanning the surrounding forest, suddenly and acutely aware of how alone he was, how far from help. The forest, which moments before had felt like home, now seemed alien and menacing. The normal sounds, the chatter of a squirrel, the call of a raven, had ceased. In 40-plus years of walking these woods, Dale had learned to trust that silence. Silence meant a predator was near. Dale unslung his rifle, working the bolt to chamber a round, the metallic click loud and profane in the stillness. He waited, watching, listening, his heart rate picking up. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned. Dale breathed out slowly, feeling foolish. Probably a bear, he told himself. A big, cantankerous grizzly, awake when it should be denned up for winter. That would explain the tracks, explain the destroyed trap. Yet the explanation felt hollow, a lie he was telling himself for comfort. He moved on, but the rest of the day was tainted by a new and unwelcome vigilance. That night, back in the cabin, Dale couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He cleaned and stretched the furs by lamplight, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind replayed the day's discoveries. The bent traps, the strange tracks, the unnatural silence. A bear, he told himself again, just a bear. But he didn't believe it, and when he finally climbed into bed, he took his rifle with him, leaning it against the wall within easy reach. Tuesday brought a new discovery that shattered his fragile rationalizations. He was checking the southeastern line when he came around a bend and stopped dead. A massive ponderosa pine had been marked. Long vertical gouges ran down the trunk, deep furrows that exposed the pale wood beneath the bark. The gouges started 10 feet up and ran down to about 7 feet from the ground. They were claw marks, but like no claw marks he'd ever seen, each one 2 inches wide and deep enough to fit his finger into. More disturbing was what surrounded the tree. In a 20-foot circle, every sapling had been snapped off at waist height and piled in a crude ring. It looked deliberate, like a territorial boundary. And inside that ring, in the snow, were hundreds of those same impossible tracks. The wind shifted, and a smell hit him, so powerful and foul that he gagged. It was a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else, something wild and rank that made his eyes water. He backed away, rifle ready, every sense screaming danger. This wasn't random destruction, this was communication, a warning. Dale abandoned the rest of the trapline and headed back to the cabin. The feeling of being watched now, a palpable presence on his back. He was running. For the first time in his life, the Montana wilderness had made him afraid. That night, Dale heard it for the first time. Lying rigid in his bed, he heard a sound drift through the darkness. It started as a deep rumbling he felt in his chest, then rose into a howl unlike any he'd ever heard. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was too deep, too powerful, and it carried in it a quality of rage that made his skin crawl. It came again an hour later, closer, and then again, closer still. By the fourth howl, it sounded like it was just beyond the clearing around his cabin. Between the howls, he heard heavy footsteps crunching snow and branches snapping. Dale didn't sleep. He sat in a chair facing the door, rifle across his lap, and waited for the dawn. Wednesday brought a heavy snowstorm, trapping him inside. He couldn't bring himself to leave the cabin anyway. The fear had blossomed into a paralyzing terror. He paced, checking the windows, seeing only the swirling white curtain of the storm. He knew he should check his traps, that animals were suffering, but the thought of stepping back into those woods was unbearable. By Thursday morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, sparkling white under a bitterly cold, clear sky. The thermometer read -15. He knew he couldn't put it off any longer. His duty to the animals, a code he'd lived by his entire life, outweighed his fear. He dressed in every layer he owned, loaded his rifle, and stepped out into the brutal cold. The southeastern section was a gallery of horrors. More destroyed traps, another territorial marker, the tree stripped of bark, the broken saplings, that awful stench. At the fifth trap he found a bobcat, still alive, its front paw caught cleanly, but something had found it first. The animal's hindquarters had been torn open, its entrails spilling onto the snow, steaming in the cold. It had been tortured, left to suffer. Surrounding it were hundreds of those tracks. Dale's stomach heaved. This wasn't an animal. This was cruelty. This was a message. He raised his rifle and ended the bobcat's agony, the shot echoing like a thunderclap through the silent forest. He was 2 miles from his cabin, the sun already sinking, when he heard it. A scream, human in quality, but impossibly loud, full of terror and agony. It came from the north, echoing through the trees, and then cut off, leaving a silence that was somehow worse. Every instinct screamed at him to run for the cabin, but there had been something familiar about that scream. He couldn't just leave someone in trouble. He turned north and started walking toward the sound, his fear a living thing crawling up his spine. He crested a ridge and saw it below, a splash of bright arterial red against the white snow. He followed the massive blood trail down into a small clearing, and what he saw there broke his mind. There, at the base of the Douglas fir, was Jimmy Kowalski, or what was left of him. The skinless body was positioned upright against the trunk, displayed, and hanging above it, tied to a branch, was the skin itself, spread out like a flag. Dale's legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the snow. This wasn't possible. Animals didn't do this. This required intelligence, deliberation, hands. But the tracks were everywhere, and the smell was overpowering. His mind ran through the possibilities, bear, lion, wolf, human, and rejected them all. That left only one explanation, one his rational mind recoiled from, but his gut accepted with absolute certainty. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The creature of folklore was real, and it was a monster. The light was failing fast. He had maybe 10 minutes before full dark, and he was miles from safety, standing in a clearing that stank of blood and death. He turned and ran. He didn't think, he just moved, driven by pure animal terror. He crashed through the undergrowth, slipping and sliding, his lungs burning, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. He heard it then, behind him, crashing through the forest with no attempt at stealth. Heavy footsteps, faster than his, gaining ground. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw it. A massive, dark shape, too tall to be human, moving on two legs with a loping gait that covered ground with frightening efficiency. And he saw eyes, two glowing points of reflected light watching him. He knew he couldn't outrun it. He had no choice. He spun, dropping to one knee, bringing the rifle up in a single motion. And there it was, 30 feet away, clear in the dying light. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown matted fur. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hanging past its knees, ending in hands with long fingers tipped with curved claws. Its face was almost human, but hideously wrong. A flat nose, a lipless mouth full of sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed with a malevolent, ancient intelligence. The creature stopped when Dale aimed. It didn't seem afraid of the gun. It just stood there, watching him, assessing him. Dale's finger tightened on the trigger. He had 5 rounds that could drop an elk. He couldn't miss, but something stopped him. This thing had killed Jimmy slowly, displayed him as a warning, but it hadn't killed Dale. It had circled his cabin, chased him, but it hadn't attacked. It was giving him a choice, one chance: leave this territory and never come back, or die like Jimmy. Slowly, never breaking eye contact, Dale lowered the rifle. He stood and took a step backward, then another. The creature didn't move. It made a sound then, a deep rumbling vocalization that vibrated in Dale's chest. A warning, a threat, a dismissal. Go. Dale turned and walked away, fighting the urge to run. He could feel those eyes on his back, expecting at any moment to feel claws tearing into him. But nothing came. He walked for what felt like an eternity, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded. The creature was gone. He reached the cabin 2 hours later, stumbled inside and locked the door. He sat on the floor and wept, for Jimmy, for himself, for the world he thought he knew, which was now shattered forever. He knew he couldn't report this. Who would believe him? They'd think he was crazy, and sending a search party would only create more victims. No, the forest would claim Jimmy, and the secret would remain. When full light came, Dale began packing. He took only essentials: papers, a few photos of Sarah, food, water. He left the furs, the traps, the tools, relics of a life he could no longer live. By mid-morning he was walking out, following the logging road back to civilization, not looking back. He reached Whitefish 3 days later, a haunted man who looked 20 years older. He checked into a motel, called a real estate agent, and put his cabin up for sale. He told the agent he was just done with the wilderness, ready to retire somewhere warm. The cabin sold within a month to a young couple from California, eager for the peace and solitude of the mountains. Dale almost warned them, but what could he say? He took their money and walked away. Dale Rutherford moved to a retirement community in Phoenix, Arizona, where the biggest danger was the heat. He never trapped again, never even went hiking. He spent his remaining years surrounded by people, never alone, never in silence. But every night, when he closed his eyes, he was back in that clearing, smelling that stench, seeing Jimmy Kowalski's skin hanging like a flag. He died 7 years later of a heart attack. His last words, spoken to a nurse, were a final, desperate attempt to pass on the message. "They're not empty," he'd said, his voice urgent. "People think the mountains are empty, but they're not. There's things up there we need to leave alone. You understand? We need to leave them alone." The nurse had smiled and patted his hand, assuming he was rambling. But Dale had been perfectly lucid. The message had been delivered to him, but it died with him. And the creature that had killed Jimmy Kowalski, the creature that had granted Dale his life in exchange for his territory, remained in those mountains, ancient and savage, waiting for the next person to cross the invisible line and learn that some warnings are written in blood and horror, on a flag of human skin that nobody ever sees until it's far too late.